All right, we're almost there. Last piece of the lecture. We're going to finish up this part of the lecture with common themes of dress across time. So the themes are going to include how we differentiate ourselves through what we dress. So we'll talk a little bit about dress as part of gender designation and identity. We'll talk about dress by age or by status. That includes occupation, marital, or just using dress as a designation of luxury. So those are the things we're going to talk about in this part of the lecture, and then we will finish up chapter 1 by talking about some ancient civilizations in the next part of the lecture. All right. So with these origins of dress and fabric and adornments, there still were some limitations for the design of garments, right? So in essence, people had to use what they could get, right? So many early humans in colder climates didn't have a choice but to use animal skins. In the ancient Near East. In Mesopotamia, Egypt, Sumeria, they had a little bit more options because they had animal skins and they were able to cultivate flax and cotton a little bit later. So, there was a limitation of what you could have based on what you could get, right? So people in isolated regions were limited to using local materials, what they can get locally, right? And that's why even to this day, when we think of some garments, we think of them as a regional garment. So oftentimes when we think of wool as a northern European fabric. When we think of silk, we think of silk as a Chinese or an Asian fabric. When we think of cotton, we think of cotton in terms of, well, in terms of Egypt, even though India and South America are the first places that it was cultivated. But we think of some fabrics as regional fabrics because they were limited. Folks were limited to the use of local materials, right? And as those local materials, as humans develop and learn ways to spin yarn and weave fabrics, these techniques were used to make clothing and they replaced the use of skins. So we talked about the four motivations of dress, and let's spend a little time in these next few slides. We're going to talk about the function of dress, the common themes across time for the functions of dress, really just in a social construct. Okay, so just in the social context of dress, and first is just the designation of gender differences. So a little bit earlier, we talked a little bit about what men wore and what women wore, and in the social construct, it really has these differences. Reflect different cultural views of the social roles appropriate to each sex. So, fortunately and unfortunately, there are no universal customs that exist that dictate, what forms of dress are really important, are really only for one gender or another. And from the kind of the late Middle Ages to the 20th century in Western dress, skirted garments were designated as female, and breeches were designated as male, right? And understanding the part that clothing plays in reflecting gender related issues really requires some knowledge about the relationship between the sexes in a particular cultural context. So I'm going to ask for you to think about your cultural context, what culture you come from and what background you're from, and if there are specific gender roles that are expressed expressly through the garments that an individual wears. The way that men and women dress has always had some differentiation, right? So even in the ancient world where there were a limited number of garments, what was worn was different. And we'll talk a little bit about it in a few minutes, but in part, um, protection, part what occupation you had, in part modesty, right? So traditionally in most, even in most ancient countries, men were still, much like today, were allowed to work in an environment, or exercise or do in an environment shirtless. And in most Western cultures, that's not encouraged. African cultures is another story, but in most Western cultures, it's encouraged for women to cover their breasts, and for men to be able to be topless, right? So the components for men have been pretty consistent across time, but in the ancient world, men generally wore a loincloth, an apron, some kind of skirt or tunic. They wore wrapped, long garments, shawls and cloaks, and women were pretty much covered, head to toe, right? So they may wear apron or some kind of wrap skirt, or a very, very long tunic. So the designation of age, right? Sometimes clothing does serve to mark, age-associated changes, right? Throughout much of history, and even to this day, infants, children up until a certain age were the same type of clothing. In really, in the past century or so, the designation of what color, those children wear is different. So at one point, kids pretty much wore white or neutral colors, and then we got to the boys wear blue and girls wear pink designation, which is a whole, another conversation for probably your gender studies class in sociology. But there is a time where it does what you wear is determined on your age. And so think about it. If you just think about the places that we shop, right? So if I throw out some names of retailers, you will have a designation in your mind of what they wear. So here we go. So people that shop at Justice, right? There's an age range if you know that store, Justice, or American Eagle, or if we talk about Banana Republic, right? If we talk about Chico's, right? If we talk about Kmart, right? So those designation of age, even though across Kmart is across the spectrum, but really that's where old people shop, right? So the designation of age definitely does have a function of dress in our society. So the designation of status, and status can be a couple of ways, right? So, originally, uniform dress or a particular style of dress frequently designated what your occupation was, right? So, you know, um, businessmen wear X, right? Whatever that is. Firemen wear Y, right? A uniform, literally a uniform. So dress, designated to occupational status, is not just limited to a uniform, but it is the earliest form of identification of your occupation, a uniform, right? So status could be in occupational status, right? So, police and firefighters and, clergy, wear a uniform that identify them as members of a certain status group, right? Um, Marital status often can be used as a custom of dress. So, if we think about adornments and jewelry, right? A wedding ring is a designation of a status of I belong to someone else, right? So a form of adornment that is outwardly used, and in many countries, it was in history and still today, it's customary for married women to cover their hair, um, or for unmarried women to go without head covering. So there could be a religious status in there as well. But you know, what women do when they're married versus unmarried. Okay. And then of course status as a terms of socioeconomic status. So what you wear is a determination of how much money you have to spend on this item, a garment, a piece of clothing that is utilitarian, right? That has utility, that has a function, right? So, in theory, we all need shirts, we all need pants, we all need socks, we all need undergarments. But how much we spend on those things is a function of status, and the adornments that we wear as well is a determination of status. So you can often calculate and come up with a judgment or an assessment of what you think someone's social status is based on what they're wearing. It's very, very superficial because oftentimes people who have a lot of money don't dress like it, and people who have no money spend all their money on the outward appearance to show their status. So one of the other functions of dress is the use of clothing, right, for some type of ceremonial use, and ceremonial use not just of a religious leader or of an organization. So a pastor or a priest, wearing a ceremonial garb, but also us as individuals wearing ceremonial garb. So sociologists speak of rites of passages that move people from one status to another, and that often requires wearing designated garments, right? So women get married and we wear a white dress in our culture, right? In Western culture, in many Asian cultures, the bride wears red, and even wearing a white dress isn't something that was done throughout time. It's something that, again, is relatively new in the past couple hundred years of us actually wearing white dresses when we get married. But, in modern American society, things that are considered, appropriate for weddings and baptisms and, burial, mourning, and graduation, there are things that we wear. So we wear a cap and gown when we graduate, right? We wear black when we're in mourning. We dress people up in their finest clothing to be buried, right? So those ceremonial things, right? And those oftentimes are to strengthen the sense of community, right? Again, those are rites of passages, and they serve a function, right? The use of ceremonial clothing, they serve a function to bring us together. And they also, even I mentioned American culture, American society, they can it can vary from what part of American society you're in, what is customarily worn for some of these ceremonial activities. All right, and last but definitely not least, one of the functions that dress does in our social context is to, enhance, sexual attractiveness, right? So clothing is a means for us to attract a partner or maintain our relationship with a partner. So, in some cultures, it's quite explicit. With clothing focusing on women's breast, or in Asian cultures, oftentimes it's the back of the neck, right? So when we see the geisha culture, it's sexual attractiveness by being more covered up and showing minimal amounts of skin, whereas typically in American and European culture, it's showing less. It's what the waist looks like and what the hips look like, and how we emphasize that, right? So fashion changes, especially in women's dress, were the result of the shift in what was considered you know not just attractive, but what was a turn on, right? So there have been points in times where a super tiny waist was a turn on, right? So invention of the corset, right? Or in the 20s, it was the flattening of the breast, like the flappers, right? So they wanted to be they didn't want to be curvaceous. They wanted to be very slim, slim looking. There have been periods in time where more robust, curvy women were, the curvier you were was seen as a sign of influence, right? But you wanted your garments to be able to show um, that attractiveness, right? So, sexual attractiveness definitely is an aspect of dress, and in modern Western society, men often are considered attractive when they appear to be affluent and successful. And they do that through how they dress, right? When we just talked about status, right? So the outward appearance of having, you can't see my air quotes, nice clothes or expensive clothes, denotes how affluent and successful a man may be. So the enhancement of sexual attractiveness. So to finish up this lecture, I just want to tie the things that we've talked about together, right? So the purpose and the function, the nature and the origin of dress, and really we can tie it up using this analogy that you know clothing, fashion, dress is just a means of social communication, right? So in the discussion that we've had, the conclusion is that a person who's knowledgeable about a particular culture, that person can look at dress as a silent language, right? It tells the observer it tells us something about the organization of a society in which it's worn. It talks about the social structures and stratifications. It reveals whether the society is rigid in its socioeconomic classes or not. It tells us if it's a classes society, right? It talks about, it can show us what our political leaders are doing, and it is an aspect of social organization. It Our social organization is manifested in how we dress and what we find as important, right? So the garments that are worn by religious leaders distinguishes them from worshipers, or it may show no differentiation, right? The roles of men and women are distinctly identified by dress. And when social rules are clearly defined, there is a sharp distinction in what men and women wear. So that's what we're gonna end this chapter with, that thought, with clothing as a means of social communication, and then we're gonna move on in the next set of PowerPoints. We're gonna move on to the ancient world, and we're gonna talk specifically about a couple of ancient cultures and what they wore.